Well, welcome.
This happens everywhere I go.
I've heard. So, I get to say my spiel first here. I'm glad you're all here. My name is Mike Fleming, and I'm the chair of this church's Green Sanctuary Council. Just a little plug here, our church is committed to the principles of Unitarian Universalism, one of which is respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are part. Following that principle, 3 years ago, we became the first solar-powered church in New Hampshire. As a church, we don't endorse political candidates, but we're happy to host this series of events addressing the crucial problem of climate change. This is the 6th in the series. You'll have to endure me changing pages here because I cannot talk extemporaneously. So first I want to set some expectations. These forums are intended to be educational for New Hampshire voters and raise the level of discourse on the topic of climate in the 2020 presidential campaign. To achieve that, we encourage both the panel and the audience to ask hard questions. However, these forums are the opposite of an internet chat room or Twitter. This is our church, a safe space for everyone, and we ask you to listen with your minds and your hearts and to be respectful of one another even when we have strong differences. Here's an important practical point. Turn off your cell phones, please. And another important practical point, the restrooms are in the back in the lobby. So the hardest question about climate is a moral one. Will we choose to leave our children a livable earth? If we do, serious climate solutions have to meet 5 difficult criteria. They must be, first, effective and not just symbolic. They must be fair. They can't increase the already great disparities among our people. 3, they must be economically feasible. Help but not hurt the economy. Number 4, they have to be fast, because every year we delay will make the problem worse. And number 5, and maybe the worst, and the most difficult, they must be politically sustainable for the rest of this century, meaning 20 presidential elections and the likely many changes of political control. Thanks are due here to Mr. A. And to his staff, can you raise your hands? Oh, they're probably out working somewhere. They don't want to admit it. And we're really honored to have you all here. I also want to thank our distinguished panel here, of which I will talk a little bit about later. And finally, I want to give a hand to all the helpers from this church and from the community, older folks, well, middle-aged folks, and younger folks. And those younger people who are here, we're really here for them because it's the fate of their planet that's at stake. So I've cobbled together some bullet points on Mr. Yang's biography from his website and Wikipedia. And apologies if I've gotten anything wrong, and correct me if you'd like to. Mr. Yang was born in 1975 in Schenectady, New York, to immigrants from Taiwan. He's an American entrepreneur, philanthropist, and lawyer. He's worked in various startups and early stage growth companies as a founder or executive from 2000 to 2009. In 2011, he founded Venture for America, a nonprofit organization that focuses on creating jobs in struggling American cities.
So far, so good.
Thanks. For his work at Venture for America, the Obama administration selected him as a champion of change and also recognized him as a presidential ambassador for global entrepreneurship. He's the author of 2 books, Smart People Should Build Smart Things, not dumb people should build dumb things, and The War on Normal People. His campaign slogan, I think everybody probably knows it by now, is Make America Think Harder. And supporters of Mr. Yang's campaign are called the Yang Gang. Naturally. Mr. Yang's signature policy is what he calls the freedom dividend, which is a universal basic income in the form of a $1,000 monthly check for every American adult, and he believes that the UBI, the universal basic income, is a necessary response to the rapid development of automation, a problem we have these days. As of December 2019, Mr. Yang qualified and participated in all 6 Democratic debates. And to quote him, "I'm running for president as a Democrat in 2020 because I fear for the future of our country." I think a few of us here agree with that. Please give a warm welcome to Mr. Andrew Yang.
Hello, New Hampshire. It's great to be here. What a tremendous setting, what a tremendous group. I went to high school right here in New Hampshire. I don't know how many of you know that. Went to Phillips Exeter Academy, graduated in '92. So coming here is a bit like a homecoming. I came of age in this state. I went to college in Rhode Island, was an unhappy lawyer for 5 months. And then I did a series of things that Mike described. We're here today because you all are passionate about climate change, and I am too. And climate change, in some ways, it's a very difficult thing to be passionate about because you feel like the problem is so big. You feel like you can take actions individually and in your household and maybe even your community, but you know on some level that that's like the tiniest drop in the bucket. And that the problems, unfortunately, continue to grow in scope. When you see the images of the wildfires in Australia that strike you more as almost science fiction movie hellscapes rather than a real developed country in our world, and then you look up and you see our government that essentially has fallen way behind the curve on addressing these challenges. And our government is not responding in large part because our government is not looking out for our kids' futures, for the future of the planet. What are they looking out for? They're looking out for the corporate interests that have overrun the place and now control the levers of policy. That is what we have to change as a country, and we do not have a great deal of time. This is one of the main reasons I'm running for president, is try to restore our government to us, the people of this country. And I love campaigning here in New Hampshire because you all have that power in a way that other Americans do not. Other Americans look up and see our government as a series of pipes that are clogged full of money, and they look up and they say they can do nothing about it. They are generally correct. They can do next to nothing about it. But you all can. So I'm just going to try to demonstrate for you all how you all are among the most powerful people in our country today. I want you to show me with fingers how many presidential candidates you've seen this cycle. So this would be 4, this would be 10, 15. So go ahead and show some. So she's seen 20, 10, 7, 3, 4, 6. I like the ones. It makes me feel like that's the only person who got to leave the house. So the reason why the presidential candidates come and ask for your support is because we know that you have the power to change the future of this country very, very quickly in just a few short weeks. I've done the math. Do you know how many Californians each of you is worth? In terms of voting power? 1,000 Californians each. So if you look around this room, and then also the overflow room out there, how many of us are there here tonight? I'm going to give a Trumpian estimate. There are 1,700 people. So, legitimately, I think there are about 100 people in this room, and the room out there. about 100 people would still be 2.5 football stadiums full of Californians in terms of your ability to influence the future of this country. And I'm an entrepreneur. One of the things about being an entrepreneur is you set out to solve problems. So let us all imagine together that our problem is climate change and we have to solve it. And this is real. Like this is, this is not hypothetical, unfortunately. So what you do as responsible humans is you say, okay, let me do what I can in my own community, my family, like I'll recycle, like we'll invest in this awesome solar-powered church and facility. And then you have the sinking feeling that things are continuing to get worse. Now, I'm an entrepreneur, and I prefer to actually go straight to the top to solve the problem. So step one is we have to recapture the government from the corporate interests. We have to send someone up there that has zero corporate PAC money, zero corporate obligations, does not care about what the fossil fuel companies and the lobbyists think or care about, and flush the pipes clean. That is step one. That, in some ways, is the easiest step. So you get someone up there, and then they show up and say, okay, corporate lobbyists run this town. Can't get anything meaningful done. So the way you change that is you wash out the lobbyist cash with a flood of people-powered money. So what do I mean by that? You would try and pass a rule where you get the corporate money out of politics, but it's very, very hard to get the corporate money out of politics because it's been there for decades. That place is like overgrown with it. So what you have to do is you have to give every American voter 100 democracy dollars that you can give to any candidate or campaign. And this would unify our people and the financial resources and wash out the lobbyist cash by a factor of 6 to 1. Make it so that our legislators actually answer to us. Yeah. Because we're the ones that can actually control the resources that can get them reelected. So that's step 2. Step 3 is we have to go to our fellow Americans and say, hey, look, we have to get consensus on climate change, and there are a couple things that are keeping us from it. Number 1 is that 78% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, and almost half of us can't afford an unexpected $500 bill. So when you're in that kind of financial scarcity and someone comes to you and says, we need to worry about climate change, what is the natural response?
It's going to cost me.
I can't pay next month's rent. Like, I have more immediate problems. Climate change can kind of wait in line. And then the human response is to say, it must not be that big a deal anyway, because I can't really think about it. So step 3 is we have to get the boot off of our fellow Americans' throats. Like, lift this cloud of scarcity and insecurity that is keeping them from being able to actually solve the problems of our time. That's where this freedom dividend of $1,000 a month in your hands comes in. Because with $12,000 a year, all of a sudden, people would feel like their future is secure, their kids' future is secure, and then when you say we need to make progress on climate change, they'll say, yes, we do. Are you with me so far?
Yeah.
Yes? All right. And then step 4, after you actually lift the cloud, and this mindset of scarcity I'm describing is real. Studies have shown that if you can't pay your bills, it has the functional impact of decreasing your IQ by 13 points, or 1 standard deviation. So if you feel like our fellow Americans are getting less reasonable, less rational, less optimistic, they are. Because that is what you'd expect if you were to introduce pervasive financial insecurity into a country, which we have done. Step 4. When you go to Americans and you say we need to fight climate change, and let's say they can pay their bills, many of them still hear, you want to raise my prices, you want to make my life more inconvenient with plastic straw or paper straws or whatever the heck, and you want to do something that's going to reduce jobs. So what we have to do is we have to say no. What we want to do is actually move our country towards a more sustainable future, and that will be pro-growth, good for jobs, and actually save you money. So I'm a numbers guy. What do you all think the cost of climate change will be? Trillions and trillions of dollars, and unfortunately thousands and thousands of American lives. Who's paying that price? Right now we are, but the corporations are not. So what we have to do is we have to get these costs onto the bottom line of the companies. Now that sounds impossible, but it's very doable. What you say is, hey, for every unit of carbon or ton of carbon your firm is emitting, you have to pay. And then you take that money and use it to move us towards more renewable sources of energy. You build the cost of climate change into the bottom line of the companies, and then you take those resources and move us in the right direction as fast as possible. Now step 5, believe it or not, that was step 4. Step 5 is now you have hundreds of billions of dollars that you are using to subsidize the fossil fuel companies. You move that towards making our communities more resilient and adaptable. One thing I find irresponsible is when a politician says we have to prevent climate change. We are already in the midst of climate change.
Too late.
I have been to the communities in Portsmouth and Iowa where they've already been ravaged by climate change. In Portsmouth, buildings are flooding that never flooded before. A multi-million-dollar shrimping business went to zero because the water got warm and all the shrimp died. In Iowa, they've had historic floods. They've had once-in-a-century floods. Now they're concerned they're going to have it once every 5 or 10 years. So preventing this is something that possibly we might have been able to do if we'd got our acts together literally decades ago. So at this point, we have to do a combination of reducing emissions, but also investing in making our communities stronger, safer, resilient, more adaptable. And part of this means, again, putting resources directly in the hands of our people. Because who suffers the most when there's a flood or storm or natural disaster?
Poor people.
The poor. People who don't have shelter to go to or cars to get into and drive away. So by putting resources into our own hands, we make ourselves more resilient. And then we can't let our communities be on their own on this. We need to take these hundreds of billions of dollars and start directly investing in making our communities safer through seawalls and levees, elevating structures, things that frankly will save us money if we invest right. Now this all sounds like a lot, but we're not done, unfortunately. Because the United States of America is responsible for approximately 15% of the world's emissions. So how are we going to get the other 85% down? Right now, China is exporting coal-burning power plants to Africa. They're saying, hey, we've got a power plant for you, it burns coal. What does the African government say in response?
Yippee.
Great! African government doesn't care about emissions. It's like, I just want power, cheap power. And so, how are we going to change that? We have to be at the same table with the African government saying, do not take the coal-burning power plant. We've got these solar panels that you should use instead. And we're going to subsidize them so that it's a no-brainer for you. We subsidize certain exports. We need to subsidize renewable technologies to the highest possible levels. So this is the 6-part plan for us to genuinely combat and counteract climate change and protect ourselves and our people. But it all starts with breaking the stranglehold that the fossil fuel companies have on our government. And that starts with getting the right person into the Oval Office in just 3.5 short weeks.
Well, thanks very much. We now go into phase 2 here, which is questions from our special panel. These 4 people to the sides of Mr. Yang are all experts who know something about climate change and environment and policies that might be good to try to prevent or ameliorate it. And each panelist has 5 minutes to expand or correct anything I've said wrong about their introduction biographies, which I'm going to give to you. And to ask Mr. Yang a question about what he said tonight about his proposed policies related to climate change. So, because it helps me remember, let's start on the left. On the left we have Judith Spang, who many of you know because she's from Durham, and she is in the New Hampshire House of Representatives and a representative from Stratford County 6 district. And you were first elected in 1998.
This is what political longevity looks like.
Well, people must like you.
Microphone.
I'm sorry, my natural voice is pretty lousy. So I was going to say she couldn't be here because she was in the legislature doing her job today, but she raced down here and didn't get caught by the police. But she was there for votes on the higher minimum wage, banning single-use plastic bags, and an independent redistricting commission, and on family medical leave. And all those passed except the one on redistricting. Her professional experience includes working as a corporate strategic planning and market research regional planner and a city regional planner. City regional planner. She's also been a member of the town of Durham Planning Board and the chair of the Lamprey River Advisory Committee, a member of the Durham Task Force on Land Protection, a member of the Durham Conservation Commission, and on the City Regional Planning Commission, and I think she's won a couple of awards, but I don't know what they are. So I'm gonna, what else was I gonna say here? You have a question here that I was gonna read if you weren't here, but I think you can ask the question for yourself.
Thank you very much for coming and talking with us. You spoke about the effect of climate change on flooding, and I would like to look at the other side of the coin. I've been responsible for the past 22 years in the legislature dealing with water issues, whether they're rivers, the ocean, groundwater, etc. And I was very involved with that effort by a foreign company to come in and take over one of our local aquifers to export water. Climate change is already increasing the droughts catastrophically in the Southwest, and even here in New England and in New Hampshire we have had water bans recently, which we have rarely had before. We are also beginning to see the arrival of water refugees, as I would call them, people who are coming from African countries because they're no longer able to live in those countries, so they're moving here, and I see a future of more of this. Should steps be taken to prevent or control the relocation of populations and businesses from water-stressed areas so that they don't deplete the water supplies of places like New Hampshire that have enough water for our current needs?
Well, first, congratulations and thank you for your leadership and work for the community. I know enough about state legislators here in New Hampshire that you're certainly not doing it for the money. At the last debate, I was asked whether the federal government should fund climate refugees in this country. Actually, they asked, I think, 4 different candidates, and no one answered at all, as far as I could tell, and until it got to me, and I said, of course we should. We already do that. We've already relocated at least one town in Louisiana that became uninhabitable because the water line rose too high. So the climate refugees are just getting started. And if you look worldwide, many of the migrant groups that have gone into Europe were driven there by climate change, where they had crop failures and they weren't able to feed their people, and then violence broke out, and then large numbers of people said, well, I can't stay here if it's going to be violent, my family's in danger, so they started to leave. And Western countries have not been able to manage that to the degree that they want to. The United States has not been the subject of this kind of migration thus far. though it is just starting to become more measurable and more real here in the US. So to me, we have to get our arms around this as quickly as possible because people will do what's best for them and their family. We have to get in front of this instead of behind it. So what I mean by that is to acknowledge that this is happening, this is real. If there's a community that is losing its ability to provide water to its people, then of course the people are going to leave. So we have to invest the resources in that community now to sustain that water supply if possible. And then acknowledge if it's not going to be possible, that if these people are going to relocate, where are they heading? Where would be the best place for them to go? You don't want them to go to some place where they're going to strain those resources additionally. You'd want them to go to some place where, let's say, this particular commodity is not an issue. Now, our government has been asleep at the switch on many, many problems over the last number of years and decades. I'm passionate about technology, as many of you know. How many of you knew that the federal government got rid of the Office of Technology Assessment in 1995? So if our government feels like it's 25 years behind on technology, we absolutely are, because we actually got rid of the group that's supposed to tell our legislators about what technology issues are coming 25 years ago. So if that seems like very poor timing to you, I agree. And the same is coming true now when it comes to the ravages of climate change. I'm an entrepreneur, and many entrepreneurs, I'm gonna stand up for fun. Now, many entrepreneurs don't like government as the solution. The problems that we're facing right now are so massive that there is no solution that does not involve an active, invigorated government. And certainly the problem you're describing of climate refugees is in that category. There is no body that adapt and provide resources for significant migrations of people that is not our government. So we have no choice but to help our government speed up so it can actually address these challenges in a real way before people just vote with their feet and just head to places that they think are going to provide a better way of life for them and their family.
Thank you. So we have 3 more panels to go. This one is someone I've known for a few years, and I realize I don't know how to pronounce her last name. Lila Corman, Glazer or Glazer? Glazer. I would have guessed correctly. I should have just went ahead and you would never know I didn't know how to pronounce it. And she's the director of 350 New Hampshire Action, which is an independent organization working to stop the climate crisis by building grassroots support for a just transition to renewable energy and an end to fossil fuel use and expansion. Lila, I don't know much about your earlier life, but I'm sure it was great. And now I give you the microphone.
I purposely didn't give Michael any details about my bio, so he couldn't say anything. So my name's Lila. I'm the director of 350 New Hampshire Action. For those of you who are familiar with 350.org National, 350 New Hampshire is an independent group, so we are not legally or financially attached to the national org. And just as a disclaimer, my being here is not an endorsement. So I got involved with climate activism for the first time about 8 years ago when I was still a teenager. And I'm sitting here today, 8 years later, because for the past almost decade, I've been watching my elected officials and the people in power ethically fail my generation by completely ignoring and failing to take action on the climate crisis.
Bullshit.
Before I ask my question, I just want to be really, really clear that this is our last chance, folks. This election, this is the last chance. 4 more years under Trump are 4 years that we are never, ever going to get back. And so I encourage you all, if you care about this issue, like I do, to 1, do your research. Everyone says they're a climate champion. Go do your research, figure out who to support, and then get involved with an organization that is working to get out the vote, or a campaign that is working to get out the vote. Because if we don't, it's going to be too late. All right, I'm ready to ask my question. So I was really happy to hear you talk about the problem of fossil fuel exports from one country to another. In this community, in this room, myself included, many of us have spent a large part of the past 2 years fighting to stop the Granite Bridge fracked gas pipeline. For those of you who haven't heard of it, it's a proposal to build a massive pipeline just a couple miles away from here. It would cost New Hampshire ratepayers a couple $100 million, threatens our health and safety, and locks us into fossil fuel use and dependence for decades to come. And now part of the reason, because it feels like these pipelines are always happening, and part of the reason that New Hampshire is constantly under attack from frack gas pipelines is the industry's desire to get gas to the coast for export. And as the fracking industry faces increasing debt and increasing resistance from people like us, they're turning to overseas markets, leaving our communities to pay the price of polluted air, polluted water, and a destroyed climate. And so my question is, if elected president, will you set a global standard for clean energy and protect communities like ours by banning the export of fossil fuels? And I would really appreciate if you could preface your answer with a simple yes or no.
I'll stand up. First, let's give Lila a massive round of applause.
Yeah.
And I couldn't agree more that we are failing on the next generation epically. I have kids myself who are 7 and 4, and I'm ashamed of the world we're leaving them. They deserve better, and we must do better. We have been subsidizing fossil fuel companies for decades to the tune of tens of billions of dollars a year, well past any appropriate level. And now, because of all the money, they now have a hold of our legislature and they go and say, hey, these subsidies, we need them. We will never make money without them. Which we all know is nonsense. I mean, they're some of the most profitable companies in our society. So we need to zero out those subsidies immediately. And then we need to take those subsidies and move them directly to wind and solar, electric cars, and try and go towards zero emissions as quickly as possible. I am against fracking. I'm against fracking pipelines in communities that want nothing to do with them. I have seen that fracking has really almost nightmarish impacts on some of the communities that are close to the sources of energy. When there are people that are living there, they suffer in the same way. That right now in this country, if you have money on one side and people on the other, which wins? Money. And that's what we have to change together as a country. Now, I would not commit to a blanket ban on exporting fossil fuels, because if you are a fossil fuel company and you don't get any subsidies, and you are producing energy in a way that's not fracking, and you find a market that's outside of the US that wants to buy it, to me, that shouldn't be something we immediately put a stop to. But I would say that the government should not be subsidizing these firms at all, and should be moving our energy production towards sustainable sources as quickly as possible. If there are legacy firms that are able to find a market in another place, like I don't think banning that necessarily is helpful, but I would say no to fracking, no to pipelines, and no to putting dollars over our kids' health.
Our next panelist is from Maine. I was trying to get all our panelists to be from New Hampshire, and he snuck in here. He has the environmental science and policy role on the panel, and he's the chief scientific officer at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute in Portland, Maine. He also runs the Climate Change Ecology Lab. He's an expert on how climate change impacts ocean ecosystems. He's actively working to bring climate information into decision-making for marine resources, including fish, whales, and lobster. He was the lead author of the Oceans and Marine Resources chapter of the 4th U.S. National Climate Assessment, and that's a pretty big deal. And he was recently appointed by the government man to the Maine Climate Council. I didn't even know there was one of those. Guess we don't have one here. So with that introduction, I'd like Andrew Pershing to give his question to Mr. Yang.
I appreciate being allowed in New Hampshire. My institution is known for our work documenting the warming trends in the Gulf of Maine, looking at the impact on species like lobster, like cod, like whales, and shrimp that you mentioned. And a lot of what we're doing now is trying to help coastal communities and resource managers to shift from thinking and reacting to change, looking backwards, to really trying to look forward, prepare for the changes that we know are coming, and have a more adaptive and resilient future. But one of the lessons that emerges as you look at the data, especially as you look at the climate models, is how challenging adaptation is going to be, and how limited our options are going to be, especially if we're on a high CO2 path. So my question to you is, how will the Yang administration prioritize limited resources for adaptation? So for example, how will you go about deciding which communities get an investment to protect them from coastal flooding, and which communities are we going to have to retreat from?
I love your work so much.
Yeah.
You know what Andrew reminds me of? Andrew reminds me of the smart guy at the beginning of the disaster movie. Andrew comes back with readings from the body of water being like, no, you don't understand. And then the government ignores him, and then the giant squid comes in. The premise of my campaign is that we have to rewrite the rules of this economy to work for us and our people, because they are not working for us now. And I have some insight that many Americans do not have into what a giant fabrication it is that we do not have the resources to do better for our people. I'm going to give you an example that most of you will remember. Do you all remember voting for the $4 trillion bailout of Wall Street 10 years ago?
Too big to fail.
Do you remember anyone looking around saying, we're going to get the money for that? Where are we going to get the money? $4 trillion, that's a lot. I don't remember anyone saying that. We had a choice 10 years ago, bail out the banks or keep Americans in their homes, and we chose the banks. When it's time for the banks to get their hundreds of billions of dollars, or the companies to get their $1.5 trillion tax cut, which Trump passed a couple of sessions ago, no one ever looks around and says, where's the money? But if you have a coastal community that says, hey, we need to invest in an impending disaster because our producers are about to have their volume go down, and then people who literally invested generations in these businesses are about to see it go down the tubes, and no one there is remotely ready for it, then right now our attitude is like, your problem, you're on your own, we don't have the money for that. So when you ask, how are we going to pick and choose which communities to invest in, we are the richest, most advanced society in the history of the world. Our economy is up to 21 trillion and counting. I have been with, and I'm even friends with, some of the wealthiest people in our country. There is unimaginable wealth in this society. It's just not being put to work for us. And one example I use from right now that most people also understand, Amazon's a $1 trillion tech company closing 30% of our stores and malls. How much did Amazon pay in taxes last year? Zero. So if you're getting zero from the $1 trillion tech company, then it seems very hard to find the resources to look out for coastal communities in New Hampshire and Maine. But if Amazon's paying its fair share into the economy, and Google and Facebook and Apple and the rest of the gang that are now parking hundreds of billions of dollars in overseas tax havens, trying to extort us, saying like, well, we might bring it back if you give us a tax holiday. Like, if you shut that down, then all of a sudden you realize that we do not need to be choosing between our communities or telling all of our people that we don't have enough. But this is how much power you all have. You have to make it so that we're getting our fair share from the trillion-dollar corporations that right now are paying zero into the system. If we do that, then we can say to each of our communities, we have the resources to help you adapt to climate change, and we don't need to pick one of you over the other.
Well, finally, our last panelist is Reverend Michael Leichenberger. Did I spend? I got that right. Okay. And he's taking the role of faith community representative on this panel. He's a minister of the Concord Unitarian Universalist Church. I must be a member of this church. He was born in Bremen, Germany, and in his early years lived in the Black Forest and in the Rhine Valley. He came to the U.S. for college and graduated from Brown University with a double.
Brown U.
So his first double major was in chemistry and environmental studies, and then he worked as an environmental consultant under contract at EPA. But in 2006, Michael moved to Chicago, where he received his Master's of Divinity from Meadville Lombard Theology School. So that's a change.
I like him, I was born in Chicago.
In addition to his duties with the Concord UU, Reverend Leichenberger serves as the president of the Northern New England chapter of the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association, serves as the chair of the Concord Coalition to End Homelessness Board of Directors. He has regular pastoral visits at the New Hampshire Prison for Men. He serves on the ethics committee at the Concord Hospital. He was appointed by the governor to the New Hampshire Suicide Prevention Council, serves as an adjunct professor at Meadville Lombard Theological School, and he moonlights as a choir director. So I hand the microphone to you to ask your question.
Yes, I'm a preacher. I love this microphone, so thank you for giving me this opportunity. But really what I want to say, it feels a little bit like we're preaching to the choir. And I love being in this room, the energy, and everyone sort of behind that consensus that you started talking about, right? That is core to moving this along. And yet, my question really is, I grew up in Germany, and there, this is not a partisan issue. The climate crisis is not whether it's a progressive or conservative. Everybody's sort of on board with the climate crisis as the issue. The question is about, how exactly do we figure this out? Yeah. And so my question to you is, as our leader, if you're elected president, what will you do to help us get unstuck in this situation?
You probably sense this about me, but I believe in science.
Yay!
So I'm going to get a little bit nerdy. Maybe not that nerdy. My parents met as graduate students at UC Berkeley. My father got his PhD in physics, and my mom got her master's in math and statistics. So when I was growing up, I thought that everyone's dad had a PhD. I would say, what's your dad's PhD in? And then I looked at the heart rate, and someone was like, this is what his PhD is in. I was like, oh, no. What did I say? So I have a very highly academic family. My father, after he generated 69 US patents for GE and IBM, then became a professor of physics. My brother's a professor, my uncle's a professor, my grandfather was a professor. I've been the educational runt of the family really the entire time. So how do we get more Americans on board with a set of facts that certainly everyone here agrees with? I touched on one major factor, which again is this financial insecurity that pervades our country. And one of the things that the financial insecurity is making possible is people who ignore the facts in lieu of something that they find to be more convenient and palatable. And the second part of it is the polarization of our media. where I've been running for president for a little while now. I've learned some things. I've gone on Fox News a number of times because I think it's important to talk to Americans of every political persuasion. One thing I did not realize until I was running for president is that Fox News' ratings are significantly higher than MSNBC's or CNN's. CNN, which you'd see as like the relatively neutral arbiter, their ratings are not as high as MSNBC's or Fox's. MSNBC and Fox have found that you can make more money by having more polarizing content. And they turn it up to 11, they find that drives more viewership, which drives more ad revenue. And again, this is about profits over people, because now you have a profit-driven media industrial complex that says, you know what, let's try and let people know that maybe climate change isn't that big a deal. And they tend to be backed by the fossil fuel companies that love to spread misinformation because they don't want the American people all to come together and say, we have to get rid of your subsidies, we have to move in this direction. So as president, number one, again, is to lift the mindset of scarcity and get the economic boot off of people's throats so that they can think more clearly. Number two is to go to the media companies and say, look, I know your advertising revenue gets driven by certain forms of content, but we need to develop a national consensus around certain facts and figures. And the facts around climate change are chief among them. Now, my preferred means of making this happen is to sit down with someone as their leader and say, hey, look, you're a Fox News anchor. Let's try and figure out why you're communicating this way about climate change, and let's see if we can change it. I believe if we get enough key opinion leaders in certain places on board with the fact that climate change is not a partisan issue, and we make it so that people feel like their future and their kids' future is secure, then we can build much more national consensus and unity around climate change and the facts of climate change. That's not going to be easy. I don't think you can get 80-20, but you can certainly get it up to a point where we'll have enough unanimity to take much more dramatic and concrete action to address this crisis that threatens us all.
Well, that concludes our panelist section of this event. We're next going to have audience questions, but first I have to say a few things. If you have a question, oh boy, I was going to say people come to the center aisle, but that's going to be difficult. Instead, I think maybe we'll take more advantage of the fact we're going to have somebody who's going to be holding the microphone and taking it to you. And I've already forgotten your name.
Sorry.
John, stand up. Give her a hand. She's the microphone bearer, but I'm not going to give it to you right away. I'm going to have to say a few more things. Before you ask a question, please give your name and where you're from. And as I think I indicated before, please be respectful and no gotcha questions or long speeches. We're not here to score points, but to understand Mr. Yang's views on how to respond to the climate crisis. Be short and to the point so others can have their chance. We only have 12 or 15 minutes left here, even though we're running over. And please limit your questions to ones that have to do with climate policy, because that's what this thing is all about. Do I have another page? I'm not sure I do. I don't think I do, and I'm going to hand this right over to John. And first question, pick the first hand that saw a little back there. Can you reach that?
I don't need the microphone, I have a strong voice.
Yes.
I'm Jim Farrell, I'm on the UNH faculty, I live in Lee, New Hampshire. Nuclear power, where does it fit in your plan for climate change?
I guess I need the mic, because my voice is strong. I think if we're in a crisis, which we are, then we need to consider every possible solution, and nuclear power belongs among those solutions. I would invest in next generation nuclear reactors that have many virtues that are absent from some of the previous nuclear reactors. And that, I believe, would help us transition as a bridge towards a more carbon-free, carbon-neutral future. The other big thing I would do, and I referred to this a little bit earlier, when I talked about how the economic measurements right now don't include climate change, what we have to do is we have to actually transform our economic measures to focus on how we are doing, which then brings climate change front and center. So right now, how do we measure our economic progress as a country? GDP, corporate profits, and to some extent, headline unemployment. Those are the numbers that get thrown to us every day. Now again, the cost of climate change, if it was incorporated into things, would be trillions and trillions of dollars that right now does not hit the bottom line. GDP, I believe, is the wrong measurement. Because if you have a town that gets flooded and flattened, that's actually good for GDP. Because you have to spend money on rebuilding that town. I don't know how much of you knew that. So climate change will be good for GDP, because we'll just be sitting here building and rebuilding everything over and over again. Even the inventor of GDP said 100 years ago, this is a terrible measurement of national well-being, we should never use it as that. And here we are 100 years later, riding it off a cliff. I know, it's pretty embarrassing, if you think of it that way. So as your president, I will modernize GDP to focus on how we are doing. So that's our children's health, mental health and freedom from substance abuse, clean air and clean water, proportion of Americans who can retire in quality circumstances. And if you change the measurements into more human measurements, then obviously having an inhabitable planet becomes key. And that when your environment degrades, that has an immediate negative effect on your measurements. Like we all know that climate change is already having a negative effect on kids' respiratory issues and like many other things. If you have the wrong measurements, you can't see the problems and you certainly can't invest in solving them. This to me is one of the most profound changes we can make as a country. Imagine if every year, instead of saying corporate profits are at record highs, you actually saw things like kids' health are at record highs, mental health and freedom from substance abuse are at record highs. Not just a feel-good thing, because right now corporate profits are at record highs. You know what else are at record highs in the United States of America right now? Depression, anxiety, student loan debt, suicides, drug overdoses. It has gotten so bad that our life expectancy has now declined for the last 3 years in a row because suicides and drug overdoses have each overtaken vehicle deaths for the first time in American history. You know the last time our life expectancy declined 3 years in a row? Spanish flu of 1918, a global pandemic 100 years ago killed millions. So if you have corporate profits and GDP going up and people dying sooner, which do you listen to? Right now, unfortunately, shockingly, we're listening to the first. We're saying, hey, everything's great, everything's great, everything's great, and then we and our kids know that things are not great. So you're looking up being like, why do they keep telling me that things are great when I can sense that there's a mental health crisis in my community, like my neighbors' kids are addicted to drugs or smartphones, like all the I'm gonna laugh, but it's true. So if you change these measurements, you change everything, and then you can genuinely incorporate climate change into economic progress in a way that all Americans can understand. And this is one way we can generate consensus to your question, Michael.
Back and forth here, so this is totally arbitrary.
Hi, my name is Emma. I'm from York, Maine, and I'm a volunteer with the League of Conservation Voters. I want to know, how does your climate action plan work to ensure that a transition to a clean economy will be just and equitable for all Americans?
Thank you. Again, it's about actually having that as your priority. So right now, if you don't have measures in place for inequities, then making them better or worse does not actually hit you. But if you say, look, everyone's quality of life is my core measurement, then if I do something that pushes some people into distress and helps others, then that actually shows up in your measurements. We all know, again, that the least among us are going to be impacted the most by climate change. And so we should have that as one of our top priorities and say, look, who are the people at the bottom end of the resources in our society, and then how can we make sure that they are not left behind, and have that as your measurement of success. I'm a data guy, I'm a numbers guy, you can kind of tell. And if you don't have a measurement goal, then you're almost never going to hit it. I've run organizations that have had goals, and goals are like magic. If you have a goal, then everyone starts pushing in that direction. And so if you have equity as a goal, then I believe you can achieve it in a way that you can't if you don't actually put that front and center.
Hi, I'm Allison Howland. I'm from Durham, New Hampshire. The fossil fuel industry has known that they were causing the climate crisis for decades, yet they continue to make billions of dollars off the destruction of our planet and my future. How will you hold fossil fuel industry executives accountable for their crimes?
Unfortunately, what you're describing, Allison, happens across industries. And so I referred in passing to the overdose epidemic that America is experiencing, and New Hampshire is one of the epicenters of that nationwide. That was a man-made epidemic. It was a disease of hyper-capitalism run amok, where Purdue Pharma dispensed hundreds of thousands of OxyContin prescriptions to Americans and said it was non-addictive, and then it was super addictive, and now we're still wrestling with this plague that has killed tens, hundreds of thousands of Americans. Same is true of the bankers that crashed the economy, causing the financial crisis. We bailed them out. No one actually suffered. They went around saying, who could have known? I, for one, looked at that and said, well, you could have known because it was your job to know, and you were getting paid hundreds of millions of dollars to know. So if you didn't know, maybe you should give that money back. Just a thought. So when you look at the fossil fuel company executives, unfortunately, they're like just components of a parade of executives that have put money over us. One of the proposals I have, the most dramatic proposal, is that if the government has to bail out your company or fine your company more than $100 million, then your leader has to go to jail.
Yeah.
And this is born of what I saw when I looked at the opiate epidemic. So Purdue Pharma was a company that profited from OxyContin. They got fined $635 million by our government. It sounds like a lot. Until you realize they made $30 billion, they paid a 2% fine on behavior that killed tens of thousands of Americans. So if you look at that, if you look at the fossil fuel executives, they're going to profit to the tune of tens of millions of dollars individually because that's the way they're compensated. And then if you go to them and say, hey, you contributed to wrecking our planet, they'll be like, well, I'm rich and I will be able to afford, like to live in the one safe, non-disastrous place on the planet or whatnot. So if you're going to dissuade that kind of behavior, you need to hit them where it hurts. And the only way I identified was for them to take personal responsibility for a set of behaviors that hurts us at a societal level to the point that they get fined hundreds of millions of dollars. There's no other way to do it, in my opinion.
Hi, I'm Doria from Durham. Thank you for being here. Planes, trains, and automobiles, what does a young American transportation future look like?
Thanks, Doria. I love it so much. I love it. Okay. Let me tell you all about it. I love trains. So I'll put that out there. I've been to other parts of the world where you have these high-speed trains that feel like magic to an American. Because you go the equivalent of a distance between New York and Boston in like 85 minutes. It feels like you're bending the laws of time and space. And each of the stops along that rail then becomes an enormous community, because then you can commute to the equivalent of downtown Boston in 40 minutes. And then that actually becomes very reasonable, even though that 40 minutes might be 65, 70 miles away. That said, the United States of America does not have that many corridors where high-speed trains make sense. We don't. I wish we did. We're also very, very bad at building these things, even if we have a corridor that does make sense, because there are many, many hurdles, some of which we like. So, if you're looking at a transportation system of the future, you put trains in where you can, but the best path forward is electric cars. And I have very, very real concerns about autonomous cars over time, in part because it's going to displace one of the most common jobs in our country, driving cars and trucks for a living. That said, our current car ownership model actually is very, very inefficient and contributes to climate change at very high levels. What percentage of the time are you actually using the car that you own? He says 2, 10, that's generally right. Like, I think the studies are something like 6%. Like most of our cars are idle most of the time. So if you can imagine a fleet of emission-free, electric, autonomous cars that are just going around, and you just like tap your thing and say, I want to go here, then it just stops, and then you hop in, and then you can just, you don't need to drive, you can just chill out, like talk to your friends or entertain yourself in this pod. And it also would enable you to commute significant distance, because you could lie flat while you're commuting in your own personal electric pod. So that hour commute, actually, you don't need to be that awake for it. You can just like go to sleep and then roll out. And so that is what the transportation system of the future can look like. And happily, a lot of that would reduce fossil fuel emissions significantly, because you don't have to own a car. You just essentially are using an emission-free vehicle whenever you need it to go from place to place.
Hi, my name is Phoebe. I'm from Rye. I'm an intern with the League of Conservation Voters. I'm a member of Generation Z. So I am moved by candidates and elected officials who have committed to achieving 100% clean energy and net zero carbon pollution economy-wide by 2050. And I'm aware that you've already committed to doing so. But my question to you today is how you plan on doing so as president.
Thank you. Yes, I do want zero carbon emissions by a little bit before 2050. And there are a number of things we have to do to try and get there. Number one is put a price on pollution to try and get your emissions down very quickly. That's a huge move, because right now these companies that are emitting, it's like, what are they paying? They're not paying anything. So you make them pay, then all of a sudden their behavior changes, you get emissions down. You get tons of resources then to push towards renewables in wind and solar, and I'd said nuclear, which I believe has to be part of the puzzle. You have to move towards electric cars. If you look at the sources of emissions, cars are very high on the list. This is going to be somewhat controversial, but if you have an emissions measurement and tax, then some of our food production that produces tons of carbon actually gets incrementally more expensive, and then people naturally gravitate towards lower emission food sources and alternatives. So this is like the giant shift that we have to undertake. One thing that may be surprising to you all, but in terms of our habitations, if you live near a place with mass transit or whatnot, like you generally emit less. Like there are things around the way our settlements are arranged that can influence our emissions. I love this structure so much. I was reading a book called Project Drawdown, which you probably know about. And it was talking about architectural designs and methods of the future that can get our structures down in terms of their carbon impact very, very quickly. They even had things like wood skyscrapers as a design of the future. And I saw that, and I thought that was so awesome. Because if you look at it, it looks like a freaking giant elven treehouse, but it's made out of like, I mean, like who would not want to go into that building? Like I would show up outside that building and be like I don't even care what you do inside there. I'm gonna get a job at one of these companies. So these are things that we can invest in if we incorporate the cost of pollution into our operations. Because right now, if you're an architect, are you going to recommend the wooden skyscraper? It's like probably not. It seems kind of out there. But if there's like an economic incentive being like, hey, this is a zero emissions building, and even the material itself is zero impact in a particular way, and you make that cost effective, then you can actually start pushing things in the right direction. It won't happen overnight, but we have, in this plan, we have a bit less than 30 years to get it done. And we can get it done if we move very, very dramatically, particularly by pricing carbon emissions from day one. This is so fun though, I love these people.
How do you contend with, like, I know I saw an article, Florida just banned the ability to ban plastic bags, so it's like, states are taking, you might be taking 3 steps forward and various state governments are taking 2 steps back, and I mean, how do you contend with people trying to do that kind of stuff? It's just like, almost they're giving it a big FU to everything you're trying to do,
So putting a price on things is super helpful. When I'm in Asia, they actually make you pay for the plastic bag. I don't know if you've been places that have that. Do they have it in your town too? That changes behavior so quickly. Like as long as like, even though the cost is insignificant, you're like, I'm not gonna pay 15 cents for your bag. And then you're like, how much is the reusable bag? And you get one and you start carrying it around. In America, we are a little bit fixated on free, Like to me, if something has an incremental cost, you have to have people see that cost, and then you can change behavior. If there's a particular state that's trying to stand in the way of that, we do live in a country where you can have certain rules that can, frankly, govern some of these behaviors in various states. Now, I'm not the most heavy-handed guy in the world, where I like to try and do a combination of carrots and sticks, but certainly, I think having, for example, like a national surcharge on plastic bags would be a very reasonable step at the. That's the kind of thing that a state legislature doesn't have control of. We should also be putting a tax on things like very wasteful packaging. When you get those So the challenge really is to put a cost on the things that have a cost to us all. If we do that, then I believe we can make very, very rapid progress. How's my timeline, my team? All right, thank you. Here you go.
Michael Warnock, I'm actually 5 houses down the street. My question is, in a common day where there's so much misinformation from both political pundits, industry, and social media, such as today where Zuckerberg just said he will not combat false ads on Facebook. What is your take on that, and how would you combat that?
This goes back to Michael's question about how do you generate consensus. One of the biggest problems we have right now is that people don't trust really anything anymore. And I looked, do you know what our trust in media is right now on a percentage basis? It's something like 27%. Very, very low. We have to turn that around. You know what news that people trust more? Local news. But unfortunately, we've gotten rid of over 2,000 local newspapers in this country because they're classified as the internet, and there's been no replacement. one of the most trusted sources of information in American life is libraries. People just love libraries and librarians. Anything they say, they're like, yeah, that must be right. So one thing we can do is make libraries hubs of information and even start to take on some of the roles of local papers and put philanthropic and public resources to work in having these new sources of local information take root. It'll also give libraries more to do, and our public trust in them is very high. I think Facebook is completely in the wrong by not having to verify the truth of political ads on their site. And I propose something that other people, find controversial, but if you put two dangers side by side, danger number one is we descend into a cacophony of half-truths and no one knows what the facts are, and you have deep fakes. There's a picture of me like doing something reprehensible and everyone's like, oh,